used to think world records were just cool, but after seeing what people are willing to risk to break them, they don't feel the same. I'm Timothy, and today we're breaking down the worst deaths from record attempts. From a girl who floated into the sky with no way back down to a circus performer chasing a record until one small mistake tore through him from the inside. It was May 18, 2016, in a community park in Fresno, California. The grass was dry, the air was calm, and from the ground the setup looked harmless, which is exactly what makes this case hard to shake. A few weeks earlier, Chloe Ramirez, 27, had been preparing for a stunt she'd been planning for months. She worked early shifts at a coffee stand, just trying to keep up with rent, and spent the rest of her time focused on one goal, setting a record that could change her situation. Prize money and recognition weren't guaranteed, but even the chance of it felt worth chasing. By then, Chloe had turned balloon lift tests into something more serious. She bought helium balloons in bulk, tied them into groups, and tested lift with sandbags in an empty lot. A friend helped build a simple harness using webbing straps and metal rings. It spread the weight across her shoulders and waist. It could lift her off the ground. It did not give her any control once she was in the air. That's where the risk started to build. Chloe wasn't aiming for a short lift. She wanted to go higher, far enough for it to count as a real attempt. But her testing stayed close to the ground. She focused on how to get up, not how to come back down. That detail stuck with me more than I expected, because once you build something that only works in one direction, you're not really testing it anymore. You're committing to it. In the days before the stunt, she counted balloons and adjusted weight, but she didn't account for what happens at height. As altitude increases, helium expands, which puts more stress on the balloon material. At the same time, even light wind becomes harder to predict once you're above trees and buildings. A parachute was discussed, but dropped because it added weight and reduced lift. By noon, around 60 people had gathered. Some were friends, others had heard about it locally, and many were recording. The balloons were tied into clusters connected to a central ring above her harness. Witness videos later showed Chloe checking the straps twice before handing off her phone. The launch itself was controlled. For the first minute, it matched her earlier tests. She rose slowly, her body steady, the balloons holding a balanced lift. From the ground, it looked like everything was working, but the conditions were different higher up. As she gained altitude, the balloons expanded slightly and became more fragile. The first failures were small, individual balloons popping or leaking. At first, people didn't react, and that's normal, because when something starts failing slowly, it doesn't feel like failure yet. Then the balance shifted. As more balloons failed, the lift became uneven. One side began to drop lower than the other, pulling her body off-center. From the ground, people could see her tilt. Someone called emergency services when it became clear she was losing lift, but there was no way to control her descent. She wasn't falling straight down. She was drifting. The wind carried her east toward a fenced electrical substation less than a block away. She came down inside the fenced area and made contact with energized equipment, triggering a high-voltage arc. The flash briefly overwhelmed the cameras. The medical findings were clear. Chloe died instantly from electrical exposure. The current disrupted her heart and nervous system immediately, and the energy release caused severe burns consistent with an arc flash event. Investigators found no evidence of sabotage or intoxication. What they documented instead was a sequence of mechanical limits being reached, balloon failure from expansion and material stress, followed by an uncontrolled drift due to wind. Chloe's case leaves you with a problem that never gets solved. Once she was in the air, there was no way to correct anything. But the next one is different. Nothing fails during the attempt. Everything holds together, right up until the moment everyone assumes it's already over. It was August 3rd, 2015. At the Tulsa County Fairgrounds in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The booth sat near the food row, surrounded by fried snacks, music, and the kind of noise that makes bad ideas feel harmless. From a distance, it looked like one more county fair stunt. Up close, the setup was already unstable. At the center of it was Greg "Gully" Hansen, 34, a laid-off warehouse worker who had turned local eating contests into steady money. He was not some national star. He bounced between moving jobs, cleanup work, and weekend challenges, using prize cash to help cover rent and keep his younger brother and sister afloat while they finished school. That part matters because this was not ego alone. It was pressure wearing the mask of confidence, and that confidence had a flaw. Greg had built a name on dry challenges, the kind where the food food fought back even before it reached your stomach. People around Tulsa knew him as calm under pressure, but also as someone who kept raising the bar once crowds expected it. At first, it was smaller portions, then faster times, then stricter rules. Each step felt manageable, and that's how it built. Slow enough that nobody treated it like a real risk anymore. The booth itself was basic: folding tables, plastic tubs, a timer, paper signage, and a narrow fenced lane to keep the crowd back. The challenge was simple on paper: eat roughly 7 pounds of dehydrated potato flakes in a few minutes without liquid. That sounds stupid, and honestly, it was. But the real problem was how the food behaved. Dry flakes do not stay dry once they hit moisture. They swell, thicken, and turn into a dense mass that is much harder to move back up than people think. And somehow, at a county fair, that passed as a good idea. Greg had practiced with smaller amounts, enough to understand the discomfort, but not enough to recreate the full danger. That day, the serving tubs were packed tighter than usual, and witnesses later said the texture looked finer than the batches he had used before. That meant faster absorption, faster expansion. A small change, but it pushed everything closer to the limit without anyone adjusting for it. I've seen people point this out in the comments before, and it makes more sense here. It's not just about doing something hard, it's about pushing a little further each time, until those small changes stop feeling like risk. He started strong. He kept his head down, packed each handful efficiently, and barely wasted motion. The first minute looked controlled. The second looked strained. By the final stretch, his pace was still fast, but his breathing had changed. Shorter, heavier, forced through his mouth. The crowd counted him down, and when he finished inside the limit, people cheered like they had just watched something impressive instead of something already going wrong. And that's the part that throws people off, because once the timer ends, everyone assumes the risk is over. Then came the release. Greg stepped back, shoulders rising hard, chest working to pull in air. Someone handed him water, and he drank quickly, more than he had taken in during the challenge. And this is where everything turns, because the dry mass inside him finally had what it needed to expand. At first, the change was subtle. He paced once, then twice, one hand pressing below his ribs. Then his posture tightened, his steps slowed. The discomfort didn't stay in one place. It moved upward. Within another minute, he bent forward and tried to vomit, but almost nothing came up. He wasn't coughing or calling out, just forcing air through his mouth in short, strained breaths. The mixture had already thickened too much. A vendor noticed the swelling before anyone else reacted. Greg's shirt stretched slightly at the front. His breathing turned shallow and fast. He tried to straighten up, then couldn't. His balance shifted, and he staggered toward the back of the booth. That's when people started to realize this wasn't part of the act. Someone yelled for help. EMTs were called, but even with a quick response, those minutes were doing all the damage. The pressure inside his abdomen was pushing upward into his diaphragm, reducing how much his lungs could expand. At the same time, his stomach was stretching past its limit, creating internal stress his body couldn't relieve. The medical findings were blunt. Greg died after the thickened potato mixture obstructed his airway during repeated attempts to vomit, leading to rapid respiratory failure. The mixture had become too dense to expel, and portions of it moved upward into his airway as pressure increased. Investigators found no poisoning, no trauma, and no foul play. Greg's death was ruled accidental, caused by the rapid expansion of the potato mixture after the challenge. Greg's case didn't fail during the challenge. It failed right after it ended. And the next one shifts that same idea into something designed to look controlled from the start. It was April 11, 2018, in Mesa, Arizona. Inside a private reptile exhibit on the edge of an industrial block, the room looked clean, organized, and familiar to everyone inside. But the way it was being used that afternoon turned a routine-looking chute into a disturbing case with almost no room for recovery. At first, Sierra Dalton looked like the kind of person who belonged there. She was 25, a freelance wildlife content creator, and most of her online identity came from acting calm around animals that made other people back away. Her videos were built around close handling, quick facts, and that risky little edge that makes viewers stop scrolling. And honestly, nothing about this setup looks criminal. It's just people pushing something a little further than they should in a place that already carries risk. By spring 2018, that pressure was getting harder to hide. Sierra had no formal training with venomous reptiles, but enough experience with non-venomous snakes to look confident on camera. She planned a record-style stunt for her channel, handling multiple venomous rattlesnakes at once without protective barriers, because safer clips were no longer performing. The room was simple. a sealed handling space with waist-high bins, acrylic barriers, and basic tools. Sierra knelt at the center while two experienced handlers stayed just outside the frame to keep the shot looking raw. Safety was there, but not where it needed to be, and that gap would matter once things started to shift. And what makes this unsettling is the type of snake involved. These are Western diamondback rattlesnakes, fast, precise, and hard to react to even when you're focused on just one. Now add several moving at once, crossing over each other, creating blind spots. At that point, it's not just about the snakes, it's about the fact that you can't track all of them at the same time. Before filming started, the snakes had already been moved more than once for positioning. That matters more than people think. Repeated handling can keep them alert, defensive, and reactive to each other, especially in a bright room with several bodies moving around them. Witnesses later said a few of the snakes were already holding tighter coils and a higher head posture. Those are not subtle signs. They're the kind of small warnings people talk themselves past when a shoot is already in motion. Sierra took her spot, the camera started, and for the first few seconds, everything looked stable. She controlled the first snake, then the second, but the whole setup forced her to divide her attention across several moving animals at once. Their bodies began sliding over each other, tightening, shifting, creating blind spots. One rattlesnake became partly hidden between the others, and that is the moment I personally think everything became unavoidable. She adjusted her grip with her right hand. Instead of redirecting outward, the obscured snake drove upward and struck high on the left side of her neck, just below the jaw. There was a sharp movement, then a sudden break in the room's rhythm. Sierra stood up fast, grabbed at the bite, and took two unsteady steps back while the handlers rushed in with hooks. Someone called emergency services almost immediately, but even that fast reaction had limits, and this is where everything goes wrong. Within a minute, swelling began around the bite site. Witness footage showed her trying to stay upright, then sitting down as her breathing changed. The venom spread quickly because of the location. The bite damaged tissue, disrupted clotting, and triggered rapid swelling in her neck, which began closing off her airway. Paramedics reached the exhibit within minutes, but by then she was in severe distress. She later died from respiratory failure and shock caused by a high-dose envenomation. The crime investigation found no attack, no sabotage, no hidden truth beyond the obvious one. The facility had allowed unsafe venomous handling for content, and video reconstruction confirmed the handlers were positioned for appearance before control. Her death was ruled accidental. Watching that kind of setup, it's easy to see how things slip. Too many moving parts, too many things happening at once. You miss one, and that's enough. But the next record takes all of that away. One system, one idea, one assumption holding everything together. And weirdly, that feels even harder to trust, because when it starts failing, it doesn't look obvious right away. It was January 6, 2013 in Osaka, Japan. Before opening hours, the aquarium was quiet except for pumps, filtration noise, and soft blue light moving through the main shark tank. From outside the glass, everything looked under control. That impression lasted less than 20 minutes. Leo Tanaka, 22, was a fisherman from a coastal village near Osaka, where shark sightings were common enough that people treated them as part of daily life. A small regional group had organized the attempt, promoting it as a record for the longest time spent inside a shark tank without a cage. It wasn't a major event, but there were cameras, local coverage, and enough attention to make it matter. For Leo, this wasn't just about the record. He wanted his village to be known for something beyond fishing. Growing up around the ocean and sharks, he believed they could be managed, and this attempt was meant to show that. His plan relied on a device he built himself, a wearable shark deterrent that created a low electric field to push sharks away. The tank was enclosed, filled with saltwater, rock areas, and several sand tiger sharks. Leo wore a wetsuit, a waist-mounted unit, and a safety tether while staff and 2 divers stood by. The goal was simple. He would stay inside for 30 minutes to set the record. If the sharks kept their distance, the record would stand, and his idea would seem proven. At first it did work. Leo descended slowly, settled near the bottom, and kept his arms close. The sharks stayed at a distance, moving in wide circles. From above, it looked stable, but small details started to change. The water was colder than expected. The unit had been sealed by hand the night before, and one of the indicator lights began flickering. And a weak signal is harder to recognize than a full failure, because nothing clearly tells you to stop. It's not a complete failure, it's worse because it almost works. And I've noticed this in a lot of cases. When something seems to be working, you start trusting it more than you should. But in a situation like this, that small bit of confidence is exactly what puts you in danger. Instead of keeping sharks away, the device may have worked unevenly, changing their behavior without fully repelling them. Staff noticed the sharks moving closer. Leo noticed too. He shifted his foot and turned slightly to track one behind him. That small movement broke the pattern. And this is where everything changes. One shark brushed his leg. Leo pulled back, tightened the tether, and stirred up sand. The disturbance drew them closer, tightening their movement around him. As the sharks closed in, one moved within arm's reach and made contact with his lower torso, delivering a sudden bite. It was a single bite, but it was enough. Staff reacted immediately, alarms were raised, and divers moved in. The response was fast, but the injury was severe. By the time divers reached him, visibility had dropped, and Leo was already losing strength. He was pulled out within minutes, but heavy bleeding had already begun. The medical findings were clear. The bite caused serious damage to the lower abdomen and upper thigh, including major blood vessels. He died from rapid blood loss before treatment could stabilize him. Investigators later examined the device and found water had entered the battery housing through a failed seal. The concept itself was not dismissed, but the unit used that day was not built for that level of exposure. After the incident, the aquarium stopped all similar attempts, and the local organizers withdrew the record listing entirely. Leo went in to break a record and prove his system worked. Instead, the footage showed the exact moment the attempt failed and how quickly control was lost. What gets me about that attempt is how close it comes to working. There's no clear failure, just small changes building up until it's too late. And the next record follows that same pattern, except this time it's just repetition, until the body has nothing left to take the impact. It was July 9th, 2017, in Dayton, Ohio. An open gym had cleared a section of the floor for a stunt challenge, with a table set up and a crowd gathering around. By mid-afternoon, the room was loud, crowded, and full of energy. But behind that atmosphere, the setup was less controlled than people realized. That's a red flag. Anton Balick was 29, a former amateur fighter whose career stalled after head injuries. He worked warehouse shifts, helped at a boxing gym, and spent weekends doing challenge events. This one mattered more than the others. It was set up as a record attempt, and for Anton, that meant a chance to be known for something again, to prove he could still push further than anyone else in the room. The setup sounded simple. A folding table stood over rubber flooring near the wall. Watermelons were stacked in crates beside it, bought in bulk and swapped in one after another. Some were ripe and soft, others were firmer and heavier. Fans pushed warm air through the room and phones were raised before Anton touched the first melon. He pitched the stunt like a record attempt. The goal was to break as many watermelons as possible using only forehead strikes before the timer ran out. He had done similar tricks before, but not this fast or in this volume. And that's where the pressure comes in, because once it becomes a record, stopping early doesn't feel like an option anymore. The warnings were there early. Anton had mentioned a headache that morning, then brushed it off. A friend handling the melons noticed some were denser than others, but kept the line moving. There was no medic beside the table, no hard stop rule, and nobody assigned to end the attempt if Anton showed visible injury. To me, that's the real problem. The setup depended on him knowing when to stop. Even though the goal was to push past limits, he opened strong. The first impacts landed with a wet crack, splitting the melons across the table as the crowd counted. Anton stepped in, struck, reset, and struck again. But after roughly 30 hits, the pace changed. His feet widened. His resets got slower. One melon dented before it split, and his head snapped back from the rebound. And this is where everything starts stacking. Witness video later showed two off-center blows in close succession, both landing higher than earlier strikes. The second barely broke the rind. Anton paused, blinked hard, then leaned in harder on the next hit, like he was trying to force the result instead of adjusting. A man near the table noticed blood on Anton's nose first. Another person shouted for him to stop. The final seconds were ugly. Anton drove his forehead into one more melon, staggered left, and caught himself on the table as if the floor had shifted under him. Then he turned, lost balance, and collapsed onto the gym mat. The room went quiet when the stunt turned into an emergency. Someone called for help. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but Anton was unresponsive. The medical findings were clear. He died from traumatic brain injury caused by repeated blunt force impacts. Investigators concluded that repeated impacts caused cumulative brain trauma and internal bleeding, leading to a rapid buildup of pressure inside his skull. The forensic analysis confirmed what the footage suggested. Blood on the table edge, witness statements, and video reconstruction all supported the same ending. Cumulative damage, ignored warning signs, fatal collapse. Anton did not die from one watermelon. He died because the goal was to keep going, and by the time stopping made sense, there was no margin left. And this next story takes that same idea, but puts it into something that looks controlled, practiced, almost routine. Because now we're stepping into a performance where everything depends on precision, and one small misalignment is all it takes to end it. It was October 22, 2014 in Des Moines, Iowa, inside a traveling circus tent. The crowd expected danger, the kind that looks controlled, rehearsed, and part of the show. But what happened that night didn't follow the script, and within moments, it turned into something no one there was prepared to witness. Julian Cross was not reckless. He was 41, a second-generation circus worker, but he wasn't a master of this act. Before this, he had worked under a magician, learning performance tricks and slowly picking up sword swallowing over about 3 years. It paid his bills, and as smaller circuses struggled, he needed something bigger to stand out. That's where the pressure came in. This wasn't just another performance, it was being framed as a record attempt. A variation no one else in his circuit was doing, something that could draw attention and keep bookings coming in. For Julian, pushing the act further wasn't about thrill, it was about proving he could do something others couldn't. That matters, because this case didn't begin with panic. It began with routine under pressure. Julian's act relied on posture, breath control, and alignment. The tent floor sat over packed dirt. The stage was raised, and the lighting rig pushed heat into the performance circle. On a table beside him sat several polished blades, each safe only if they stayed perfectly straight. Earlier that evening, witnesses said Julian looked focused. The plan was a variation he had practiced in parts but rarely performed in full, lowering multiple thin blades in sequence, then holding them motionless. That sounds small on paper, but it changed the whole system. One blade can be guided. Several blades have to behave like one object. The part that stands out here is how normal it all looks. He wasn't doing anything reckless, just a routine he'd done for years, pushed a little further than usual. And that's all it took. Not a big mistake, nothing obvious, just one small movement at the wrong moment with no way to fix it once it started. There were warning signs, the kind people ignore because the show is still moving. A stagehand said Julian asked for a towel twice before going on, suggesting the heat was getting to him. Another remembered him clearing his throat near the curtain. Still, I've seen enough cases to know the body usually gives a quiet warning before it gives out. The act began normally. Audience video showed steady hands and familiar timing. He introduced the first blade, then the next, then another, each one disappearing with measured pace. The crowd stayed silent. It also meant nobody noticed the difference between concentration and distress until it was too late. Then the tension changed. At full extension, Julian stopped, chin raised, shoulders square, holding the bundle in place. A few seconds passed. Then his shoulders tightened. His breathing became shallow, and this is where everything goes wrong. Witnesses near the front said his left hand twitched first. Investigators reconstructed it in simple terms. A swallow reflex, muscle spasm, or tiny shift in posture likely broke the alignment inside his upper chest. Once that happened, one blade edge pressed out of line and cut through soft tissue. He didn't yank the blades free, which likely means he knew removal could make it worse. From the seats, it still looked like part of the act. Up close, a stage assistant realized something was off when Julian stepped back and stopped blinking normally. Help was called within seconds of the collapse, but the damage was already inside him. He pitched forward, the blades hit the stage first, and people nearby heard metal strike wood before the crowd understood. Paramedics reached the tent within minutes. The medical examiner found a deep tear in the esophagus with massive internal bleeding into the chest. A nearby major vessel had been damaged, and because the bleeding was mostly internal, there was almost no visible warning until he collapsed. The investigation found no sabotage and no defective equipment. Julian Cross died from internal hemorrhage caused by a misaligned multi-blade swallow. In the end, the video and witness accounts pointed to the same awful answer. One involuntary movement turned performance into death.